The music rose and fell like a gentle tide, flowing through crystal chandeliers and laughter-laced conversations. All around the hall, people clinked glasses, snapped photos, embraced. Warmth lingered in the air, of toasts shared, of vows exchanged, of joy so full it filled the room. Except for one corner. There, partly hidden by the towering wedding cake and a forest of floral arrangements, sat a woman in a powder blue dress. Her name was Soraya, and she looked like a guest misplaced by the seating chart. Neither giddy like the bridesmaids, nor glowing like the couple at the center of it all. She tugged at the edge of her sleeve, not because it needed adjusting, but because it gave her hands something to do. The silverware beside her was untouched. Her glass of sparkling water barely fizzed. From where she sat, the party looked perfect, but it didn't include her. She hadn't spoken more than a few polite words all evening. The groomsmen had passed her by, offering casual nods at best. The bridesmaids were swept up in the thrill of celebration. Even the waiter seemed to forget her table. Time moved differently at the edge of a room, slower, quieter, like even the joy in the air had skipped over her seat. She sat with her back straight, pretending not to notice how alone she was. She wasn't supposed to come alone. That morning, Soraya had stared at her phone screen, heart dropping as the message arrived. A short apology, a vague excuse, a lie dressed up in politeness. He claimed he wasn't feeling well, something about a stomach bug. But hours later, she saw him tagged in someone else's story, smiling under neon lights with a drink in hand. No fever, no regret, just someone else on his arm. She had almost cancelled, almost sent a last-minute text to Isla, the bride, apologizing and making an excuse of her own. But Isla had asked her weeks ago, pleaded even, just be there for me. I need you there. And so she came. Alone. Now, as the room shimmered with clinking glasses and shared memories, she sat in the corner like an afterthought. It wasn't just about being without a date. It was the feeling of showing up half uninvited to a joy she couldn't fully access, of wearing a smile just convincing enough to not worry anyone. She wasn't supposed to come alone, but here she was. Have you ever walked into a room filled with people and still felt completely unseen? Not ignored in a dramatic way, not pushed aside, just overlooked, like your presence didn't quite register, as though you were standing slightly outside the frame of everyone else's happiness. Soraya knew that feeling well. She watched conversations bloom and dissolve without her, watched laughter rise, then settle. Couples leaned close, friends reconnected, stories flowed easily across the tables. No one was unkind, no one was cruel, but no one reached for her either. There's a quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for sympathy. It simply sits beside you, waiting, while you pretend you're fine. Soraya told herself she was okay. She reminded herself that she was here for Isla, that this night wasn't about her. Still, a small ache pressed against her chest, the kind that comes when you realize you could leave and no one would notice right away. She folded her hands in her lap, grounding herself, as if that might make her feel more solid, more present. She didn't want attention. She didn't want pity. She just wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere in the room. Soraya lowered her gaze, focusing on the centerpiece in front of her. White petals, perfectly arranged. She counted them slowly, not because it mattered, but because it kept her steady. It gave her something to hold on to, while a familiar thought pressed in. Maybe this is all I'm meant to be. Present, but unnoticed. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad in a way that demanded tears. It was softer than that. Heavier. A tired feeling that came from always being the one who adjusted, who understood, who accepted less without complaint. She had learned how to shrink her expectations so disappointment wouldn't sting as much. Still, a small part of her hoped, quietly, that the night would offer something more than endurance. But what if someone did see you when you least expected it? Not because you sparkled, not because you forced a smile, but simply because you were there, quietly holding yourself together in a room that never asked how you were doing. What if, in a single moment, everything changed? Not with fanfare or fireworks, but with a whisper. Soraya didn't know it yet, but someone had noticed her. Someone who knew what it felt like to be surrounded and still feel separate. Someone who didn't want to impress, only to connect. Someone who was walking across the room right now, just for her. And if you've ever felt invisible in a crowd, if you've ever wondered whether someone might truly see you, then this story is for you. Tap like, hit subscribe, and stay with us. Because sometimes, the quietest moments lead to the loudest changes. She had spent far too long deciding what to wear. 3 dresses lay on the bed that morning. One was too bold, the kind of dress that demanded attention. Another felt too plain, forgettable. The third, a soft powder blue number with a subtle waistline and flutter sleeves, felt like a compromise. It didn't make her feel dazzling, but it didn't make her feel foolish either. That was the one she chose. Soraya arrived at the venue just before sunset. The sky had blushed a little as she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking lightly on the stone path. The glass-paneled reception hall shimmered with soft light, the kind that made everything look like a movie. She had hoped, foolishly, that the beauty of the place might help her forget what the morning had felt like. The message had come at 9:17 a.m. "Hey, not feeling great. Think I'm gonna have to skip tonight. Sorry, so." She had stared at it longer than she should have. No call, no offer to make it up to her, just a text, so casual it hurt. Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to reply. In the end, she didn't say anything. Soraya still got dressed, still fixed her hair, still showed up. But beneath her careful makeup and the steady poise she carried on her shoulders, something had cracked. Not in an explosive way, but in that quiet, aching way where you realize someone you counted on never really considered how much it would cost you to show up alone. She smiled at the hostess, gave her name, and followed a stranger through the maze of tables. The seat they led her to was tucked behind a cake stand and a climbing wall of roses. And that's where she sat, heart slightly bruised, confidence quietly unraveling. The room was glowing. Crystal chandeliers spilled soft light over cream linens and gold-edged dinnerware. Every table was adorned with tall vases overflowing with ivory roses, blush peonies, and sprigs of eucalyptus. The fragrance of it all mixed gently with hints of vanilla cake and seasoned hors d'oeuvres. Everything looked effortless, like joy had been choreographed into each detail. Across the hall, laughter rolled from table to table like a ripple in warm water. A group of groomsmen swapped stories that made their shoulders shake with amusement. A flower girl darted between adults in a puff of white tulle. Somewhere near the bar, 2 aunties swayed to a throwback love song, arms locked, heels abandoned. The music, curated, gentle, full of old soul and subtle charm, gave the night a kind of elegance Soraya admired from a distance. Every note reminded her of the playlists Isla used to make in college, songs that hinted at love being safe, worthy, and soft. People clinked glasses, posed for photos, leaned in close to whisper stories only old friends would understand. At the center of it all, the bride and groom moved like they belonged to a dream. Isla's gown shimmered every time she twirled, and Theo, in a tailored black tux, couldn't take his eyes off her. Every detail sang of celebration, of love, of being chosen. And tucked behind it all, hidden behind a rose-draped arch and a tiered cake display, Soraya sat at table 12. From a distance, she could appreciate the beauty of it. But appreciation wasn't the same as inclusion. She could admire it all, but it didn't feel like hers to touch. Soraya kept her smile small and controlled, the kind that didn't invite questions. She had perfected it over the years, the polite curve of the lips that said "I'm fine" even when she wasn't. It was easier than explaining, easier than admitting she felt exposed sitting there alone. She told herself not to take it personally. Things happened, plans changed, but the truth pressed in anyway, unwelcome and familiar. I wasn't important enough for him to show up. The thought settled heavily in her chest. She wondered briefly if people were noticing, if they were counting the empty chair beside her, if anyone was silently guessing what had gone wrong. The idea made her throat tighten. Shame had a way of doing that, turning small disappointments into reflections of your worth. She reached for her glass, took a slow sip, and focused on breathing evenly. Crying here would be humiliating. This was not her moment. This was not her celebration. She reminded herself of that again and again, as if repetition could quiet the ache. Still, her eyes burned. She blinked rapidly, willing the moisture away, pressing her tongue lightly against the roof of her mouth, the way she always did when emotions threatened to surface. She had learned early how to hold herself together in public spaces, how to wait until she was alone before letting the cracks show. Soraya wasn't heartbroken in the dramatic sense. No tears streaking down her cheeks, no shaking hands, just a deep, sinking disappointment, the kind that came from hoping, once again, that this time might be different, and realizing it wasn't. From where she sat, the wedding looked like a world just slightly out of reach. It wasn't hostile or unwelcoming, it simply didn't notice her. To the left, a young couple kissed mid-laugh, their cheeks flushed and eyes bright with champagne and affection. A few tables away, Isla's cousins shouted over each other in a happy debate about who had cried first during the ceremony. The DJ eased into a nostalgic love song, and a dozen guests rushed to the dance floor, grabbing each other's hands, bodies swaying, dresses spinning. It was beautiful, and none of it involved her. A bridesmaid passed her table without a glance, chasing down a lipstick she'd left in her clutch. One of the groomsmen made brief eye contact with Soraya as he walked by, hesitated, then offered a shallow nod before continuing on. Even the photographer, camera in hand, skipped her section entirely. She felt like part of the decor, like a neutral-colored chair cover. No one noticed, but everyone assumed belonged there. Soraya shifted slightly, adjusting the skirt of her dress so it didn't bunch under the table. A small gesture, a subtle reminder to herself that she still mattered, even if no one else seemed to see her. Every joyful shout, every shared toast, every inside joke amplified the silence around her. It wasn't bitterness that filled her, it was absence. The absence of warmth, of welcome, of being part of the story. And yet she stayed, not because she was hopeful, but because she had promised Isla, because leaving would only confirm what she already feared, that she could disappear quietly and nothing around her would change. So she sat, still and composed, while joy danced around her like she was never invited. The silence around Soraya wasn't loud, but it grew heavier with each passing minute. It was the kind of silence that made her question things she thought she had healed from, like whether she was forgettable, or too much, or never quite enough. Old wounds disguised as calm thoughts resurfaced, wrapped in the quiet of an evening that was meant to be joyful. Her posture remained graceful, her hands still folded neatly in her lap, but inside she was pacing, wondering how it always came back to this feeling, of showing up, of trying, of being invisible anyway. What stung most wasn't the absence of a partner. It was the absence of acknowledgement, even the smallest kindness. A smile, a simple, "Are you okay?" might have made her feel like she wasn't just occupying a chair to balance out the guest count. Instead, she sat between a melting candle and a forgotten napkin, watching the world move on without pause. She was beginning to count the minutes, to calculate how long she needed to stay before slipping out without it seeming rude. 30 more minutes, maybe 20. She'd find a polite moment, say goodbye to Isla with a practiced smile, and return to the quiet of her apartment, where at least loneliness didn't wear a tuxedo. And just as she reached for her clutch, ready to make her quiet exit, something shifted. A shadow crossed the table, a faint shift in air. The scent of something clean, pine and something unfamiliar, caught her attention. Someone was approaching. Her breath hitched slightly as she turned, half expecting a waiter, half expecting nothing, but it wasn't either. It was a man. Not loud, not laughing, not looking past her like the others had. He was looking at her, and everything in her stilled. The doors to the hall opened, and for a brief moment, the noise inside softened, a brief lull as if the world collectively held its breath. The man who stepped through wasn't a spectacle. He didn't command attention with flamboyant gestures or grand entrances. He simply moved, quietly, with purpose. Dorian Vale entered the room like someone who didn't need to announce his arrival. His navy suit was immaculate, the kind that fit without effort, like it had been tailored with precision. but not for show. His tie was a deep shade of midnight, pressed perfectly, not too stiff, not too casual. He didn't wear any flashy accessories, no cufflinks or statement watches, just the clean, sharp lines of a man who understood how little was needed to say everything. A soft murmur rippled across the room, the way people reacted when a familiar face appeared in a place it didn't quite belong. There were whispers of his name, Dorian Vale, the tech guy, but they were fleeting, almost dismissive, as if his presence didn't demand anything more. As he walked through the reception hall, there were no long glances in his direction, no unnecessary pauses in conversation. People saw him, but they didn't approach him. His arrival was as much a part of the backdrop as the decorations themselves. But unlike the rest of the guests who laughed and mingled, Dorian's presence felt more considered. His eyes scanned the room not with expectation, but with the stillness of someone accustomed to observing more than participating. And as he passed by, his gaze flicked briefly over the guests, the couples in the center. The laughter that filled the air, and then, almost imperceptibly, it settled on her. Soraya. Dorian's presence was not announced by blaring music or the shuffle of his shoes on the floor. Instead, it was the way he moved, deliberate but relaxed, as if time were his to manage. The space around him seemed to part as he walked, not by any physical movement, but by the subtle aura of quiet confidence he carried. He wasn't flashy. His wealth didn't scream from the designer stitching on his suit or the glint of platinum cufflinks at his wrists. It was in the stillness he commanded, how the crowd seemed to momentarily shift when he moved through, like the space had been tailored to him. A quick glance would reveal nothing extraordinary about him, just a man a little taller than most, with an elegant air that came naturally, not in the way some people tried too hard to project status. His face wasn't famous enough to invite long stares, but his eyes, those eyes had a depth to them, calm, focused. They spoke of experience, of long hours in boardrooms, of decisions that shaped companies and created wealth that didn't need to be flaunted. He made no grand effort to gain attention. No one greeted him with exaggerated warmth, nor did he seek it. Instead, his demeanor whispered his power, a quiet leader who didn't need to claim the room to control it. His movements were soft, almost discreet, yet they carried the weight of someone who had learned that true authority came not from announcing it, but from simply being it. And as his gaze passed across the room, it rested on Soraya, a moment as subtle as a breath, but unmistakably deliberate. Dorian's gaze swept the room as if he was searching for an exit, or maybe just something real. Conversations floated around him, clinking glasses and laughter filling every corner, but none of it seemed to touch him. He didn't smile, didn't nod politely at the couples dancing or the old friends reminiscing. His expression remained composed, unreadable, but not cold. It was as his eyes moved past the long buffet table and the photo backdrop that he paused. She was seated behind a row of floral arches and a towering cake, in the kind of seat people were placed in when no one knew exactly where to put them. Her powder blue dress matched the tone of the evening, elegant, simple, soft, but it wasn't her dress that held his attention. It was the stillness. Everyone else in the room was engaged in motion, dancing, laughing, leaning in and out of conversation. But she was still, not stiff, not disengaged, present, but not performing. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't pretending to laugh at someone's joke. She wasn't trying to insert herself into the celebration. She was just there, like a breath being held in a room full of noise. Dorian tilted his head slightly, not out of curiosity, but as if something clicked. It wasn't recognition. He didn't know her. But there was a familiarity to her solitude, a kind of quiet strength that pulled him in. He didn't know her story. He didn't know her name. But in that moment, all the chatter and noise around him faded. Not because she was the loudest person in the room, but because she was the only one not trying to be seen. And something about that felt honest. Dorian hesitated for only a moment, the kind of pause that wasn't uncertainty, but intention. He didn't move toward her out of impulse. It wasn't attraction born from appearance alone. There was something quieter guiding him, an instinct that she too might be watching the world from the outside in. He adjusted his jacket slightly, exhaled through his nose, and stepped forward. His strides weren't rushed. He didn't weave through the tables with purposefully exaggerated poise. He simply moved, steadily, respectfully, with his gaze trained on her. Guests were too busy enjoying themselves to notice him walking toward the far corner of the room. The music played on. Another toast had just ended. No one was watching. Except her. Soraya sensed movement before she saw him. A faint shadow drifted across her table. She didn't look up immediately, assuming it was a server, maybe someone reaching for cake. But the scent hit her first. Clean, deep, like pine needles and cool air after rain. It was grounding, unexpected. She turned and found him standing there. For a second, her mind scrambled to place him. Had they met? Was he part of the groom's circle? Someone from college? But there was no flicker of recognition in his expression. Just quiet interest, gentle awareness. He looked at her like she mattered. Not in a romantic way, not yet. But as if her presence in that moment wasn't just noticed. It was acknowledged. He didn't smile wide. He didn't offer a joke. He simply lowered himself slightly, enough so their height difference felt less like a divide, and spoke in a voice that was just above a whisper. "Be my date tonight?" Not a command, not even a confident pickup line. A question, low, careful, and real. Soraya blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost unsure whether to meet his gaze or glance behind him in case someone else was the intended recipient. Dorian offered a small nod, his expression calm. "Only if you're willing," he said, eyes warm but steady. "You just look like the only person in this room who isn't performing." She let out a breath, half laugh, half defense. "Performing?" He tilted his head, his tone still gentle. "Trying. For the camera, for the crowd, for appearances. You're just here." Soraya wasn't sure how to respond. She wanted to ask him why her, why a man like him, put together, magnetic without effort, had crossed a room full of charm and sparkle to sit across from someone trying her best not to fold in on herself. Instead, she answered the only way her instincts would allow. "If I say yes," she murmured, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her water glass, "can we skip the small talk?" He smiled, not the charming kind used to close deals or win admiration, but a genuine one, brief and warm. "Absolutely." A pause. "Would you like to dance?" she added, surprising even herself. "I'd like that." He held out his hand. No flourish, no arrogance, just a simple gesture of connection. She looked at it for a moment, then reached out, and just like that, her world tilted. Not in a loud, life-changing way, but in the quiet sense that something different had just begun. No introductions, no long explanations, just a moment of recognition between two people who hadn't expected to feel anything at all tonight. But somehow, here they were, choosing not to be alone anymore. The dance floor wasn't crowded, just enough couples to give it rhythm, not so many that it demanded attention. A slow, soulful tune hummed through the speakers, its gentle beats swaying the air like a lullaby meant for two. Soraya stepped onto the polished wooden floor with measured caution, her heels clicking softly. She wasn't used to being seen, let alone led. Her fingers rested lightly in Dorian's hand, and for a moment she wondered what she looked like from the outside. If anyone noticed her, if they wondered who she was to him. But the thought dissolved quickly. Not because she stopped caring, but because Dorian didn't give her space to drift into her usual spiral of overthinking. Not with his eyes quietly holding hers. Not with the way he offered his other hand. Not gripping, just inviting. His palm hovered near her waist until she nodded, and only then did he close the gap. Their bodies moved in sync, not out of perfect choreography, but because neither was trying to impress the other. It wasn't a dance for the camera. There was no exaggerated spinning or eager dipping, just two people stepping into shared rhythm for the first time. And that rhythm was steady. She breathed in through her nose, slowly, allowing herself to match the quiet surety of his movements. He didn't push or pull. He moved with her, not around her. It was grounding. The floor beneath her, the weight of her own limbs, the music folding around them like a safety net. It was enough. She hadn't felt that in a long time. No forced grins, no eyes darting around the room to see who might be watching. Just presence, just this. There were no rehearsed lines between them, no exaggerated gestures meant to charm or flatter. Dorian didn't lean in with a smirk and whisper something predictable about how stunning she looked. He didn't try to spin her for show or draw attention to them. Instead, they moved as if they were the only two people in the room. Soraya felt the warmth of his hand, the subtle pressure of his guidance, and the way he adjusted his steps to match hers without making it obvious. He wasn't trying to lead in the way that demanded submission. He led with attentiveness, with patience. It was rare. Too many people mistook confidence for dominance. But this was something else. A steady, quiet kind of care that didn't ask her to be smaller or quieter, but allowed her to just be. She didn't know how to describe it, only that it felt like her body remembered something it hadn't felt in years. Ease. Dorian didn't fill the silence with empty words. He didn't ask her to smile. He didn't comment on how the music made him nostalgic, or try to impress her with stories she hadn't asked for. And Soraya, for the first time in what felt like forever, didn't feel the urge to compensate. She didn't rush to prove she was interesting or likable. She didn't reach for jokes or anecdotes to hold his attention. There was no performance happening here, only presence. Their eyes met every so often, not lingering too long, but long enough to say, "I see you. I'm here." It was the kind of connection that didn't need embellishment to be real, the kind that, if you weren't paying attention, you might completely miss. "I don't usually dance," Soraya said softly, her eyes resting somewhere over his shoulder. "I don't either," Dorian replied, almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting to admit it. That made her smile, not a wide, gleaming smile, but a small, real, one that tugged at the corner of her lips and made her eyes glint. "Why now?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He didn't fill the pause with noise. Instead, he looked at her, not through her, not around her, at her. "Because you looked like you were trying not to disappear," he said finally. "And I know what that feels like." Soraya blinked. No one had ever said something like that to her, not without trying to fix her, not without making it about them. His words weren't pity, they were recognition. She let herself hold his gaze, just long enough to absorb it. "I'm not very good at being seen," she admitted. "That's okay," he replied. "I'm not very good at pretending." That made her laugh, quiet and surprised, like it had snuck up on her. They swayed gently, the space between them softening without words needing to do all the work. It wasn't a conversation filled with grand declarations, just a handful of truths shared in the silence between steps. "You seem familiar," she said after a moment. Dorian smiled faintly. "Maybe we've both just lived through the same kind of loneliness." She nodded. It wasn't heavy, what they were sharing. It was light, because it didn't try to dig or analyze or perform. It just was, and in a room full of noise, it felt like the only conversation that mattered. They stopped dancing after one song, maybe two. It was hard to tell. The music faded into something more upbeat, and the tempo no longer matched the stillness between them. Soraya felt it first, the unspoken understanding that their moment had peaked, and now it was time to pause. They stepped aside quietly, no dramatic exits, no hand-holding for effect. Just two people returning to the edges of a party that had gone on without them. As they stood near the edge of the dance floor, Dorian turned to her. "I'm glad I asked." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because you didn't vanish," he said, "and neither did I." For a second, Soraya didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. And it was enough. There are moments in life that don't demand explanation, moments where words only dilute what presence already captured. This had been one of those moments, small, unspectacular, but unmistakably true, the kind that lingers. Maybe you've had one like that, an instant where someone saw something in you, not because you tried to show it, but because you simply existed and they noticed. Noticed your quiet strength. Noticed the tired in your eyes. Noticed the way you were holding yourself together. And maybe, in that moment, you realized you weren't invisible after all. If you've ever felt seen by someone in a single, unexpected moment, even if it didn't last, share your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if you're still waiting for that moment, stay. Because sometimes, the right person sees you before you even realize you're worth looking at. Just outside the reception hall, past the polished glass doors and a row of flickering lanterns, was the garden. Most guests hadn't wandered there yet. The music and drinks had them anchored indoors. But Soraya followed Dorian through the side exit, drawn by the hush that greeted them the moment the door swung closed behind them. The air shifted instantly. It was cooler outside, kissed by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of cut grass, night blooming, jasmine, and something sweet, probably from the dessert cart tucked away under a trellis. The evening sky was dark velvet, scattered with stars barely visible over the soft string lights looped overhead. The garden wasn't grand. It didn't try to impress. A narrow stone path curved around trimmed hedges and led to a few benches tucked under blooming archways. Fairy lights wrapped the trunks of slim birch trees. Off to the side, a shallow fountain bubbled quietly, and dancing lazily above the trimmed bushes were fireflies, tiny flickering points of light that floated like secrets. The music from inside bled faintly into the garden, muffled and distant now. The bass was gone. Only the light piano melodies remained, curling through the air like a lullaby. They reached a bench beneath a climbing rose vine. Dorian didn't speak. He simply gestured for her to sit first. She did. He followed. No one was around. No clinking glasses, no camera flashes, no half-shouted congratulations. Just the garden and them. And the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, not awkward, not empty, just still. It was the kind of quiet that made honesty feel possible. The kind that asked nothing except presence. And maybe, just maybe, it was exactly the kind of quiet they both needed. For a while, neither of them spoke. Soraya rested her hands in her lap, fingers lightly intertwined, listening to the distant echo of music from inside. It felt strange how quickly the noise of the reception had faded, as if it belonged to a different world entirely. Dorian broke the silence first. "I used to think being surrounded by people meant you couldn't feel lonely," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "Turns out, it's sometimes the opposite." She glanced at him, surprised, not by the words, but by how easily they came. "I know that feeling," she replied. "You can be in the middle of everything and still feel like you don't quite belong anywhere." He nodded. "I spend most of my time in rooms full of people who need something from me. Attention, approval, decisions. It gets loud." He paused. "You learn how to smile through it, how to nod at the right moments." Soraya swallowed. "I think I do the same thing, just for different reasons." She hesitated, then added softly, "I've gotten very good at pretending I don't need much, that I'm fine being the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who doesn't ask too many questions." Dorian leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the fireflies drifting past them. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Carrying a version of yourself that fits what everyone else expects." She exhaled slowly. "Sometimes I don't even know where the mask ends anymore." They didn't look at each other right away. They didn't need to. The truth sat comfortably between them, unjudged. It wasn't grief that demanded tears. It was the kind that lived quietly, shaped by years of being unseen. And somehow, sharing it didn't make it heavier. It made it lighter. The silence that followed their confessions didn't feel empty. It was thick with mutual understanding. Two people who didn't know each other's stories, yet somehow shared the same echoes. Soraya shifted slightly on the bench, the wooden slats pressing gently into her back as she leaned into the quiet. She wasn't used to being met where she was emotionally. Most people tried to fix, or distract, or pretend discomfort didn't exist. But Dorian, he didn't flinch from the parts of her that weren't polished. He just sat there, still, listening, "I think I started showing up smaller on purpose," she said eventually. "It just felt safer. If I didn't take up too much space, maybe I wouldn't disappoint anyone." Dorian turned his head toward her, his brows relaxed, expression open. "Or maybe you thought they wouldn't leave if you didn't ask for too much." Her breath caught. He had put words to something she hadn't dared name out loud. "And you?" she asked gently. He looked down at his hands, fingers loosely interlaced. "I built everything I thought would make me feel worthy. And when it didn't, I didn't know what to build next." She blinked at that. Not out of pity, but recognition. She had always imagined people like him, powerful, accomplished, lived untouched by doubt. But he sat beside her now, not as a man who had it all, but as someone who still carried pieces that hadn't yet found where they belonged. They were different in many ways, but the loneliness, the desire to be understood without having to explain, that they shared. Pain had introduced them, but it was hope, quiet and cautious, that was beginning to hold the door open. A breeze moved through the garden, soft enough to make the fairy lights above them flicker gently. A petal from the overhead vine drifted down between them and landed on the edge of the bench. Neither moved. Soraya sat with her shoulders relaxed, but her breath slightly shallow, like her body hadn't quite decided whether it was safe to fully let go. She could feel the warmth of Dorian beside her, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. She glanced at him, just once, and found him already watching her. Not with hunger, not with intensity, just quiet awareness. "I don't know why I'm telling you all of this," she said with a nervous laugh, her hand moving instinctively to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Dorian shifted slightly, not forward, not back. Just enough that his hand hovered closer to hers, palm facing down, fingers resting near the edge of the bench between them. He didn't touch her, but the invitation was there, not a demand, not a move, just presence. Soraya looked down at their hands, close but not touching. There was a gravity in the space between their fingers, the kind of pull that said, "If you reach, I won't pull away." But he didn't close the gap himself. And something about that, his stillness, his restraint, made her trust him more. She didn't take his hand, not yet, but she didn't retreat either. Instead, she left her fingers resting just where they were, the distance between them no longer feeling like a wall, but a possibility. It wasn't romance, not in the traditional sense. It was respect, and that somehow felt more intimate than any touch could have. Soraya sat there for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Not awkward, not tense, just open. The kind of silence that didn't pressure her to perform or explain. She could feel the rhythm of her own breathing slow, the tightness in her chest beginning to loosen, little by little. All her life, she'd thought connection had to be earned, that she had to be charming enough, smart enough, easy enough to love. She'd kept polishing parts of herself, shrinking the sharp edges, dimming the quieter ones, just to be someone worth choosing. And yet, here she was, sitting in a quiet garden beside a man who hadn't asked her to be anything but present. No makeup tricks, no witty comebacks, no emotional gymnastics to prove she was okay, just stillness, and honesty, and breath. Dorian hadn't tried to fix her sadness. He hadn't flooded the moment with reassurances or stories of his own pain to match hers. He had simply been here, listening, responding, staying, and that was enough. Maybe connection wasn't about perfection. Maybe it wasn't about saying all the right things or timing the moment just right. Maybe it was about showing up, fully, openly, and allowing someone else to do the same without fear of rejection. There was no promise between them yet. No dramatic declarations or fairy tale promises. But something had quietly begun to take root. Something real. And in a world where most people rushed to be seen, Soraya was starting to learn the deeper power of being understood. It wasn't about being impressive. It was about being present. And as she sat next to Dorian beneath the swaying lights, she knew, maybe, for the first time in a long while, that presence was more than enough. The moment had been quiet, almost sacred, and Soraya wasn't ready to leave it yet. They sat in stillness, their silence full of unsaid things that didn't need translation. The garden around them breathed softly. The faint melody of the reception filtered through the air, now layered with laughter and the clinking of dessert forks. Dorian reached into his pocket. He glanced down at his phone, just once, then let out a quiet sigh. Soraya could see the way his shoulders tensed slightly, the way his jaw shifted like he was weighing something. "Give me one moment," he said, standing gently. She looked up at him. "Everything okay?" He nodded. "It's my assistant. He doesn't call unless it's important. I won't be long." There was no trace of alarm in his voice, just quiet apology. He didn't seem like a man used to being pulled away, but the weight in his tone said this wasn't optional. Before she could respond, he was already walking down the path, phone pressed to his ear. Soraya watched him go, his figure retreating into the soft shadows cast by the trellised lights. She could barely make out his silhouette beyond the curve of the garden. He stopped near the side entrance of the building, just far enough away to give the illusion of privacy. His voice didn't carry. Whatever he was saying, he was keeping it low, controlled. She stayed on the bench, eyes drifting back to the rose vine above her, the empty space beside her suddenly noticeable. It had been such a beautiful moment. Real, unexpected, but now it was interrupted. And somehow that interruption felt like a shift. She stared down at her hands. They were still resting where they had been minutes ago, still folded in her lap like she hadn't exhaled since he stood. He said he'd be back, and yet something in her chest had already begun to tighten. 1 minute passed, then 5, then nearly 10. The breeze no longer felt calming. It tugged at her hair, lifting strands in soft twists that tickled her cheek. She tucked them behind her ear again and again, more out of nerves than discomfort. Her fingers began to fidget with the edge of her dress, pinching and smoothing the fabric rhythmically. Where was he? She glanced toward the path he'd taken, but he was no longer in sight. The faint glow from the side entrance barely lit the trellis beyond it. A group of guests strolled past, laughing and oblivious to the quiet. Unraveling taking place on a garden bench just a few feet away. Soraya's heart had started to beat a little faster, not from panic, but from the slow, creeping ache of disappointment threading itself through her chest. Maybe he got caught up in something important. Maybe he had to leave entirely. Maybe someone else called. Someone who mattered more. The thoughts came quickly, layered and sharp. She tried to swat them away, to return to the feeling she'd had just moments before. The calm, the connection, the peace. But the longer she sat in silence, the more the doubts began to whisper louder. This is what always happens, isn't it? She thought about how beautiful that moment had been, how real it had felt. But now, with each second that passed, it started to feel more and more like something she had imagined, something delicate that had already slipped through her fingers without her realizing it. She checked her phone. Nothing, no message, no call, no sign that she was remembered on the other end of this sudden pause. And yet, she stayed seated, hoping, waiting, trying not to wonder whether she should have known better than to believe in something good unfolding just for her. The hush of the garden no longer felt intimate. It felt isolating. Soraya sat for another minute, willing herself to be patient, but the emptiness next to her, once comforting, had started to echo with every unspoken fear she had kept locked away. She stood, slowly, carefully, as if her body wasn't fully convinced she was making the right choice. Her shoes pressed into the stone path as she retraced their steps, the same ones they'd taken together not long ago. This time, there was no hand gently guiding her, no steady presence beside her, just the dull ache of being left behind, even if unintentionally. She didn't storm out. There was no dramatic exit. That wasn't who she was. Soraya had never been the type to create scenes or ask for explanations when silence had already offered one. She simply walked, through the side doors, past the warm light of the reception, through a room still pulsing with celebration. A few guests noticed her passing but said nothing. A bridesmaid offered a distracted smile in passing. The groom's cousin, someone she'd met once before, glanced in her direction but didn't wave. She moved with a grace she didn't feel. At the coat check, she gave her number quietly and waited while the attendant retrieved her wrap. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fastened it over her shoulders. The scent of roses still clung to the fabric, reminding her of the garden. Of him, still no message. She could have gone looking. Could have asked someone to check for him, to relay a simple, "I had to leave." But she didn't want to beg for closure. If the moment meant something, it wouldn't need chasing. She stepped outside. The air was colder now, sharper. She exhaled slowly, watching it bloom into a soft mist before disappearing. And then she walked away, quietly, carefully, not because she was weak, but because she had learned to protect herself without burning the whole memory down. By the time Soraya reached her apartment, the night had hardened into something she couldn't quite name. She slipped off her heels at the door and stood barefoot in the hallway for a moment, just breathing. The room smelled like jasmine body mist and the faint remnants of the candle she'd forgotten to blow out earlier that day. Familiar, safe, but it didn't bring comfort the way she hoped it would. She moved toward the couch and lowered herself slowly, wrapping her arms around her knees like she used to do when she was younger, back when loneliness was quieter but still constant. Her phone sat face up on the coffee table. No new messages. He could have at least said goodbye. The thought was sharp, even if she didn't want it to be. She didn't want to be bitter. She didn't want to assume the worst. But she also didn't want to keep pretending like her heart hadn't started, to lean toward something, just a little, only for it to be left unanswered. She replayed the garden conversation in her head. His words, the way he looked at her, the steadiness in his voice when he said she wasn't alone. It had all felt so clear, but now she wasn't sure. Maybe I made this all up, she whispered to herself, her voice nearly lost in the quiet. Maybe she had seen something in him that wasn't there. Maybe he was just being kind. Maybe men like Dorian Vale offered glimpses of warmth without realizing the weight of what it meant to someone like her. Someone who didn't often get chosen. Someone who didn't often ask to be. Tears didn't come. Not yet. Just that familiar tightness behind her eyes, the kind that sat and waited. She pulled her wrap tighter around her, leaned her head against the cushion, and closed her eyes. For now, silence was all she had. It arrived the next morning. No knock, no buzzer. Just a soft thud at her door. Soraya hadn't even noticed it until she went to collect the newspaper that occasionally showed up late. Instead, there it was, sitting on the mat outside her apartment. A square box, wrapped in plain brown paper, with her name handwritten across the top in clean, even lettering. No return address, no courier label, just her name. That was it. She picked it up carefully, uncertain. The weight of it surprised her, not heavy, but meaningful, as though it had been packed with intention. She took it inside, set it on her dining table, and stared at it for a full minute before peeling back the paper. Beneath it was a white box with silver trim. Inside, nestled in soft velvet lining, was a small silver music box. Delicate, intricate, etched with climbing vines and wildflowers. It looked antique, the kind of gift you didn't buy on a whim. Her breath caught before she even touched it. A note sat folded beneath the lid. She opened it slowly, the paper crisp, the ink bold. Still waiting on our second dance. D. Soraya's fingers trembled. There was more. Underneath the note was a formal invitation. Thick cardstock, elegant print. Carrington Foundation Winter Gala Saturday, 7 p.m. formal attire, required her eyes widened. At the bottom, scribbled in pen, "You're already on the guest list. Wear the blue dress." She stared at it, stunned. Everything, the message, the music box, the unexpectedness, it felt surreal. He hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't walked away. He'd left a breadcrumb, one only she could follow. Soraya didn't move for several seconds. Her hands rested on the edge of the table, the note and invitation still, open before her like they might vanish if she blinked too long. The silence in the apartment wrapped around her shoulders, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt suspended, like the moment was waiting for her to catch up. He remembered. That was the first thought that broke through the fog. Not only had he remembered her, but he'd also gone out of his way to send something so thoughtful, so personal. He hadn't explained himself, hadn't justified the sudden disappearance the night before, but somehow this gesture made more sense than any apology could have. Still, disbelief lingered, just beneath her ribs. She replayed the moment in the garden, the silence, the closeness, the way he'd looked at her, not like a placeholder in his evening, but like a choice. But then, the waiting, the absence, the walk home, the silence. She had written it off, forced herself to let go, told herself it was safer not to hold on to something uncertain. And yet, here it was, sitting in front of her like a challenge wrapped in silver. The note was brief but intentional, not poetic, not flashy, just honest. Still waiting on our second dance. The way he phrased it, it wasn't demanding. It was patient, as if he already knew she might need time. And the final line, wear the blue dress. It pulled something from her that she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Hope, not loud, not naive, but careful, alive. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't over. Maybe this was the beginning. Soraya turned the delicate key at the back of the music box. It clicked once, then began to hum a gentle melody, one she recognized immediately. Claire de Lune. The soft piano notes spilled into the quiet apartment like a memory made audible. Her fingers froze. She hadn't heard that song in years. Not since she was a child. Not since the old apartment where her mother used to keep a similar music box on her vanity, one that had been passed down from her own mother. It wasn't identical, but the melody, it was the same. Soothing, mournful, beautiful. She remembered sitting on the floor in her pajamas, knees tucked to her chest, listening to that tune play while her parents argued in the kitchen. It was the only sound that calmed her then. Something about the way the notes floated, never rushed, never sharp. It made the chaos feel farther away. She also remembered winding it up again and again. Sometimes in the dark, sometimes just before sleep, as if the music could make the world softer for a few minutes longer. And now, all these years later, it was back, in a different box, from a man she barely knew but already trusted more than she expected. Her chest tightened, not in pain, but in recognition. She had spent most of her adult life believing that no one would ever understand the language of her quiet, that the softness she carried was too easily overlooked, too easily forgotten. But this small, deliberate choice felt like someone had reached backward into her story and said, I see you. I hear what you're not saying. Dorian couldn't have known. Or maybe somehow he did. Soraya placed the music box on her nightstand, where the last note still lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. The invitation sat beside her now, edges pressed neatly beneath the velvet ribbon. Her eyes kept drifting back to the final handwritten line, wear the blue dress. She hadn't made a decision yet. Her thoughts were a maze. One moment she felt a pull to say yes, to show up, to see what this might become. The next, she reminded herself how easily things fall apart. She wasn't used to being pursued, not sincerely, not with intention, and a part of her still feared that saying yes would only lead to another kind of disappointment. But beneath all that caution was curiosity, a question she couldn't silence. What if this time is different? And now, dear viewer, I want to ask you something. If you were in Soraya's position, if someone who left you questioning everything sent a small, quiet gesture asking for another chance, would you go? Would you dress up again, heart thudding, stepping into the unknown? Would you take the risk? Or protect your peace? Let us know in the comments. Would you have gone to the gala? Comment yes if you would have followed the invitation. Comment no if you would have closed the box and moved on. Because sometimes the smallest answers reveal the deepest truths about who we are. And sometimes what we choose to walk toward changes everything. The car pulled up to the Carrington Foundation's private garden just minutes before 7. Soraya sat still for a moment, her hand resting on the door handle, heart fluttering with quiet panic. The sky was a deep indigo now, dusted with early stars. From the window, she could see the outline of the venue's entrance, stone columns wrapped in soft gold lights. Valet attendants in matching uniforms, and guests in evening gowns that shimmered beneath the lamps. She glanced down at her dress, the same powder blue one she'd worn to the wedding. She had almost talked herself out of it. She'd held other dresses against her body in the mirror, considering options that might feel more formal, more worthy. But none of them felt like her. And something about his note, "Wear the blue dress," had made her want to honor what began that night. Not change it, not improve it, just continue it. So here she was, in the same dress, the hem slightly repaired from a snag on her closet door, her shoes simple, her jewelry modest. She didn't look like the other women filing into the gala, but she didn't want to. She stepped out of the car, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and began the walk up the candlelit path. The sound of music, live, this time played by a quartet, floated through the air like a private invitation. Laughter spilled from the entryway, soft and polished. As she reached the door, a hostess greeted her by name. "Welcome, Ms. Soraya. You're expected." Those words alone nearly unraveled her. Expected, not tolerated, not added last minute. Expected. And with that, she stepped inside. The ballroom was nothing short of breathtaking. Polished marble floors gleamed beneath the soft light of dozens of chandeliers suspended like crowns overhead. Servers in crisp black uniforms glided between tables, holding trays of sparkling. Champagne and hors d'oeuvres sculpted like art. The room itself felt curated, perfectly balanced, carefully lit and filled, with people who knew how to glide through such spaces without hesitation. Everywhere Soraya looked, she saw extravagance. A woman in a sweeping emerald gown with diamond drop earrings stood laughing at the base of a staircase. A group of men in tailored tuxedos sipped aged whiskey near the orchestra. Clutches, heels and watches sparkled beneath the lights like they'd been waiting for this kind of evening to exist. She had never felt more aware of her own quiet presence. But strangely, she didn't feel out of place. Her blue dress was understated. No embellishments, no dramatic neckline. But it fit her like it had been waiting for this night too. Her shoes were the same ones from the wedding, nothing fancy, just clean and comfortable. She hadn't changed her hair. She hadn't layered herself in statement pieces, and yet people noticed. Not in a way that made her shrink, but in the way eyes sometimes linger on a soft melody in a room full of noise. There was something grounding about her simplicity. She didn't try to match the room. She brought a different kind of energy to it. Calmer, honest, quietly radiant. She stood near the entrance for a moment, scanning the room, not looking for him yet, just giving herself time to adjust. She didn't feel invisible. But she didn't feel fully seen either, not yet. She had barely taken 2 steps further into the ballroom when she heard her name, Soraya. She turned, and there he was. Dorian stood near the base of the staircase, dressed in a black tuxedo. That didn't draw attention, but somehow made him stand out anyway. His tie matched the color of the night sky outside. No signature pocket square, no flashy cufflinks, just him, exactly as she remembered, clean lines, calm eyes, and the kind of presence that didn't rush to fill space. But this time, his expression was different. Relief. It poured across his face the moment their eyes met. He wasn't smiling out of politeness or making a practiced expression for the sake of the evening. His shoulders dropped slightly, like he'd been, holding something in until he saw her. Like he wasn't sure she'd come, and now that she had, everything could begin again. "You came," he said, taking a few steps toward her, stopping just close enough for her to hear him over the music. "I wasn't sure I should," she admitted, voice low. "I was sure you would," he replied, not boastful, not arrogant, just certain in the way. Someone is when they've spent days replaying a moment and quietly hoping it wasn't over. There was a brief pause. "I owe you 1,000 explanations," he added, voice softer now. "Maybe," she said, "but you sent music instead." He exhaled, a quiet, stunned breath, then gave the smallest, grateful smile. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. Not to the center of the room, not into the spotlight, just toward him. She didn't hesitate this time. The orchestra shifted to something slower as they stepped onto the floor. Dorian didn't guide her with showmanship, no bold twirl, no exaggerated movements. His hand settled gently on her back, his other meeting hers in a way that felt familiar now, like their bodies remembered what it was to move together, even in silence. This time, though, it was different. There was no hesitation in her steps, no guarded weight in her arms. She wasn't dancing to fill space or to make the moment look like something it wasn't. She was present, and so was he. They didn't talk, not at first. There was nothing that needed narrating. The music was soft, threaded with emotion, and the floor slowly faded into the background. Around them, the gala continued. Cameras flashed, laughter spilled from tables, waiters moved like clockwork. But inside the small circle they created, none of that mattered. He looked at her, not in passing glances, not just when she wasn't looking, but fully, like he was memorizing her, detail by detail. And for the first time, Soraya didn't look away. He had come back for her, not in a grand, sweeping apology, but in a quiet, steady way that said, "I see you. I haven't forgotten." Their steps were slower now, not guided by the tempo of the room, but by the rhythm of trust. Something unspoken had shifted. The wall that had once hovered between them, made of doubt, of fear, of disbelief, was thinning with each rotation. It wasn't a perfect dance, but it didn't have to be. What mattered was that they were still here, still reaching, still choosing each other. They moved closer without realizing it, not in a way that drew attention, not in a way meant for anyone else to notice, just enough that Soraya could feel the steady rise and fall of his breath, the warmth of his presence grounding her in the moment. The music softened, thinning into something almost delicate, and Dorian leaned in, not abruptly, not possessively, just close enough that his voice reached only her. "You're not invisible anymore." The words landed gently, but they struck something deep. Soraya's breath caught, her fingers tightening slightly in his hand. She hadn't known how badly she needed to hear that. Not from a crowd, not from praise or admiration, but from someone who had seen her at her quietest, at her most uncertain. She rested her forehead briefly against his chest, not hiding, not retreating, just allowing herself to feel it, the truth of it, the safety in being known without being dissected. "I never was," she whispered back after a moment. "I just needed someone to look long enough." Dorian didn't respond right away. He didn't rush to reassure or romanticize the moment. He simply nodded, his chin brushing lightly against her hair. "I see you," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. Around them, the gala continued. Laughter, music, polished conversations. But Soraya felt something shift inside her, a quiet release. Like a door she'd kept closed for years had finally been unlocked, not forced open, but opened with care. She wasn't trying to disappear anymore, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of being seen. There was no grand announcement, no sudden shift into a whirlwind romance. What came next between Soraya and Dorian was slower, softer, the kind of closeness that built itself layer by layer, without needing to declare anything out loud. It began with messages, not the kind that overflowed with compliments or flirty one-liners. They were short, thoughtful texts that arrived at unexpected times. "Thinking about that song you mentioned. How'd your meeting go today? You crossed my mind, so I figured I'd say it." Soraya found herself smiling at her phone in ways she never had before. His words weren't heavy or intrusive. He didn't ask for more than she was ready to give. He checked in without keeping score. She started replying with more ease, letting her guard down one sentence at a time. Then came the walks. They didn't meet in lavish spaces, no candlelit restaurants or rooftop lounges, just small parks, side streets, bookstores that smelled like dust and possibility. They talked about everything and nothing, books that had changed them, why silence sometimes felt safer than speaking, the best kind of tea when you're sad. They didn't touch often, but when they did, brushing hands while reaching for the same coffee, cup, or shoulders bumping on a cold evening, it never felt accidental. It felt chosen. Then came the calls, late ones, when the world was quieter and their voices could stretch across the darkness like thread. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Other times it was only 10 minutes. But in every call, something steady was being built. Not fantasy, not perfection. Something real. Something that sounded, finally, like peace. There was something unfamiliar about how steady it all felt. Not dull, not predictable, but steady, like the rhythm of waves brushing the shore, not trying to crash, only to arrive. Dorian never flooded Soraya with flattery. He didn't overwhelm her with grand romantic gestures or scripted surprises. What he offered instead was presence, attentive, gentle, and consistent. He paid attention to the little things, the way she hesitated before answering certain questions, the way her voice dropped when she was tired, the way she always tucked her thumb under when she held a warm mug. He didn't just notice, he remembered, and Soraya, used to being romanticized and then forgotten, didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't performing, someone who didn't try to win her over, but simply waited with her. For once, there was no rush. They weren't racing toward a label. There was no pressure to post photos or define the timeline. No tests, no games, just a slow unfolding. And in that unfolding, she learned something new. Real love doesn't chase validation. It listens. It watches. It waits until you're ready, not when it's convenient. Some nights, they sat in comfortable silence on opposite ends of a phone call. Other nights, they'd share stories, some funny, others heavy. She'd never had someone who didn't try to fix her sadness, who didn't shrink from it. That was what made this feel different. It wasn't showy, it was safe. Love, she was beginning to learn, wasn't always loud. It didn't have to dazzle. It could be quiet and still powerful. Real love doesn't rush to impress. It learns to understand. Sometimes, usually late at night after a call ended, Soraya would lie awake and think about the people she had loved before, or tried to. She remembered how quickly things used to move, how conversations rushed toward attraction, how affection came loud and fast, only to fade just as quickly. Men who liked the idea of her softness but grew impatient with the reality of it. Men who praised her for being easygoing, then disappeared the moment she needed space to feel. She had been chosen before, but always conditionally. Chosen when she smiled through discomfort. Chosen when she didn't ask too many questions. Chosen when she made herself convenient. And when she couldn't keep that version of herself alive, the closeness would thin. The messages would slow. The warmth would cool. With Dorian, none of that was happening. He didn't rush her vulnerability. He didn't grow distant when she went quiet. When she shared pieces of her past, moments she usually edited to sound lighter, he didn't interrupt or redirect. He let her finish. Let the silence sit. Let her take her time. That was new. She noticed how she didn't feel the urge to rehearse conversations before having them with him. Didn't feel the need to be brighter, sharper, more impressive. She could show up tired, unsure, human, and instead of pulling away, he stayed. That was the difference. Not intensity, not drama, not constant reassurance, just steadiness. For the first time, Soraya wasn't falling into something that demanded she disappear to be loved. She was stepping into something that made room for all of her, especially the parts she once thought were too quiet to matter. And that was how she knew. This wasn't familiar love. This was better. It started with something small. It almost always does. They were walking through the sculpture garden behind the museum, one of their quiet routines after late lunches. Soraya had been unusually reserved that day, her responses shorter, her gaze fixed ahead. Dorian noticed, but didn't say anything at first. He let the silence stretch, giving her space. Until he asked, gently, "Is everything okay?" She nodded without meeting his eyes. "Yeah, just tired." But it wasn't just tired. He could hear the edge in her voice, guarded, distant. Something had shifted. When they reached their usual bench beneath the olive trees, she sat down, arms crossed loosely over her chest. He waited, offering her the silence she often appreciated, but this time it lingered too long. Dorian finally spoke. "You've been quiet for days." She exhaled sharply. "I just need space sometimes." "I know that," he said carefully. "But I don't always know when I'm being shut out, or when I'm just giving you room." Her jaw tensed. "I'm not trying to shut you out," she replied. I don't always want to explain everything, especially when I'm still figuring it out myself." He nodded slowly. "That's fair, but it's hard when I care and I'm left guessing whether I'm part of your world or just circling around it." That struck a nerve. She stood up abruptly, brushing non-existent lint from her coat. "I didn't ask you to circle anything." He didn't react with anger. He didn't raise his voice. But something in his eyes pulled back, just slightly. It wasn't a blow-up. It wasn't even loud. But it was the first crack in something that had felt seamless until now. The walk back to the car was quiet. Not the usual kind that gave Soraya peace. This one felt stiff, unfinished. Every few steps, she considered turning to say something, anything, but the words stuck behind a wall she couldn't yet name. Dorian didn't press her. He walked beside her with the same calm rhythm, but she could feel the shift in his energy. He wasn't retreating, but he also wasn't reaching. When they reached his car, he opened the door for her without a word. She stepped in, folded her hands in her lap, and stared out the window while he circled around and got in. The engine started, but neither of them filled the space. That night, when she got home, she didn't text him. Not the usual home safe or thank you for today. She set her phone face down on the nightstand and crawled into bed still fully dressed. The next morning, she scrolled through his last few messages. All warm, all intentional. She typed a reply, then deleted it. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that caring made her feel exposed. Old habits returned quickly. She convinced herself he probably needed space too, that maybe she had been too much, too complicated. Maybe he'd realized that quiet didn't always mean calm. It sometimes meant confusion and heaviness and being half present. So she began to withdraw, not dramatically, just small things. A slower reply, a skipped call, a vague excuse when he suggested they meet up again. And the more distance she created, the more she tried to convince herself it was necessary, that he would grow tired eventually, that it was better if she left before he disappointed her. But deep down, she already missed the steadiness she was pushing away. Dorian noticed the change immediately. He noticed it in the way her replies shortened, losing their warmth, in the pauses between messages that used to come easily, in the calls she no longer returned with the same quiet eagerness. Nothing dramatic had happened, but something meaningful had shifted, and it hurt more than he expected. Still, he didn't confront her right away. He understood space. He respected it. He had built his life around reading rooms, waiting for the right moment, choosing restraint over reaction. So he gave her time. Days passed. Then, more. But patience didn't erase the sting. He found himself rereading her older messages, searching for the point where things had begun to slip, wondering if he had said too much, or not enough, if caring openly had been a mistake. When he finally reached out, his message was simple. "I feel you pulling away. I don't want to chase you, but I don't want to lose you either." He stared at the screen after sending it, jaw tight, chest heavy. This was unfamiliar territory for him. In business, clarity ruled. In relationships, he was realizing, clarity required courage. When she didn't reply right away, something in him folded inward, not bitterness, but sadness. He wasn't angry with her. He wasn't frustrated in the way he thought he might be. He was wounded, not because she needed space, but because he wasn't sure if he was welcome inside it. Yet even in that uncertainty, he didn't withdraw. He didn't punish her with silence. He stayed present in the ways he knew how, steady, open, available. Because whatever this was between them, it mattered. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't willing to walk away quietly. The silence between them wasn't dramatic. No yelling, no slammed doors, just distance that lingered a bit too long. And yet, that was what made it real. Because in real life, it's not always the storms that shake you. It is the slow drift you don't notice until you're too far from shore. Soraya sat on her bed that evening, scrolling through old pictures. One from the garden where Dorian made her laugh so hard she dropped her iced tea. Another of the croissant he delivered that morning she mentioned craving one. Little things, not flashy, not forced. Just thoughtful. She missed that feeling. But fear still curled in her chest. This was the part where things used to go wrong. In past relationships, getting close meant eventually losing herself. She'd share a bit too much, show a bit too much, love a bit too hard, and somehow she'd always end up alone. But Dorian wasn't them. He didn't crowd her. He didn't guilt her. He simply left the door open. And that quiet, consistent presence, that was harder to ignore than 1,000 dramatic declarations. Meanwhile, Dorian had retreated to his study, the city lights glowing dimly behind him. He wasn't used to feeling this uncertain. He had mastered so many things: strategy, risk, negotiation. But vulnerability? That was uncharted territory. Still, he didn't shut the door. Instead, he left a book on her doorstep the next day. No note, no pressure, just a book she once said changed her life. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here." That single act unraveled something tightly wound inside Soraya. Real love, she was learning, wasn't a performance. It was a presence, one that stayed, even when things felt fragile. It was nearly 9 p.m. when Soraya stepped outside, the city hushed beneath a stretch of cool, cloudless sky. The evening air brushed her skin with just enough chill to remind her she hadn't planned this walk. She hadn't even grabbed a jacket. She just needed to move. The streets were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that made your own footsteps sound louder than they were. She didn't have a destination at first, just a desire to breathe something different, to feel her thoughts settle into something clearer. But her steps knew where to go. 15 minutes later, she found herself standing in front of the wedding venue. It looked different at night. The lights that once shimmered with celebration were now dimmed. The lawn was empty. The arch where vows had been exchanged sat untouched, wrapped in vines that had begun to wilt under the autumn air. She approached slowly, walking across the gravel path until she reached the back garden where she and Dorian had first sat. The bench was still there, unmoved, waiting. She lowered herself onto it, the wood cool against her legs. She looked around, not searching, just remembering. This was where everything began, the night she thought no one saw her. The night someone did. The moment she let herself hope. The moment she ran away from that hope too. The wind whispered gently through the leaves above, and for the first time in weeks, Soraya didn't try to silence the ache in her chest. She let it rise, not because it hurt, but because something in her was waking back up. The garden hadn't changed, but Soraya had. She closed her eyes, letting the hush of the night carry her back to that first evening, when Dorian's shadow crossed her table, when his voice found hers in the quiet, when they danced without pretending to be anyone else. She remembered the exact moment he looked at her and saw her, not the polished version she offered to most people, but the version she often kept hidden, reserved, uncertain, still healing. The bench creaked gently as she leaned back, her eyes fixed on the place where the fireflies had drifted. She thought of the music box, the note, the way her heart had leapt when she read, "Still waiting on our second dance." She remembered the gala too, the blue dress, his steady eyes, the whisper that melted, the doubt she didn't even know she was still carrying. "You're not invisible anymore." But the memory that came next stung, the moment she pulled away, how she had let fear speak louder than truth, how she had let silence grow where words should have bloomed, how she convinced herself that love meant danger, because it always had before. She had pushed him without explanation, and he hadn't chased her with panic or pressure. He simply waited, even as it hurt him. And now, here she was, sitting in the very place it all started, asking herself what she was really afraid of, being hurt, or finally being seen. And having no excuse to keep hiding, the breeze rustled the trees above her, and she let the question linger. She couldn't change how her past had shaped her, but maybe she didn't have to let it decide who she became next. Soraya stood from the garden bench, brushing the soft fabric of her coat as if shedding layers of doubt. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting delicate shadows across the grass. Everything was quiet again, like the universe was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. She began to walk. Each step on the stone path echoed, not just in sound, but in clarity. How many times had she chosen to disappear? From hard conversations, from people who came too close, from the risk of being known. She had called it survival. But tonight, it didn't feel like strength. It felt like fear dressed in logic. Dorian hadn't demanded perfection from her. He hadn't tried to fix her. He simply wanted to see her. And she had run from that. Not because he did anything wrong, but because she wasn't used to staying when someone looked her way with no conditions. She reached the edge of the fountain where they'd shared their first real laugh, and a faint smile pulled at her lips. "I could disappear again," she whispered to the stars. "No one would stop me. No one would even know." But as soon as the words left her, they felt like an old excuse she'd outgrown. Because she would know. And Dorian would know. And it would mean choosing silence over growth. Ghosting a future because the past hadn't been kind. No. Disappearing again wouldn't be protection. It would be surrender. She deserved more than that. They deserved more than that. As the night deepened and Soraya slowly walked back down the tree-lined path, the world felt still, but not empty. She had clarity now, not all answers, but a stillness that felt earned. She paused beneath the same arch where she'd first seen the couple dancing at the wedding. The lights were dimmed now, but the memory glowed bright inside her. Someone had once told her that healing often comes in the shape of another person, not to complete you, but to reflect who you've always been beneath the wounds. For Soraya, that person had arrived in an unexpected whisper, a quiet man who offered no promises, just presence. And now, she was ready to meet him where hope lived. Because real love didn't force entry. It waited with the patience of moonlight on still water, soft, constant, and impossible to ignore once you finally turned your face to it. She looked up and exhaled. Not every love story had to begin with fireworks. Some began with a dance. Some began with silence. Some began when a quiet woman stopped walking away and turned toward the one person who made her feel seen. Have you ever met someone who made you believe in love again, just by being there? Maybe it was a friend who showed up when you didn't even know how to ask for help. Maybe it was a stranger who smiled at the exact moment you were crumbling inside. Or maybe it was someone who saw you, even when you were invisible to yourself. Tag them in the comments. Tell them, you reminded me what love could look like. Because stories like this, they're real. Sometimes, they're us. The garden had not changed much since that night when everything between them had quietly begun. The soft gravel crunched beneath their feet, and the golden fairy lights still curled along the trellis like gentle whispers from the past. But today, the air held a different kind of anticipation. Dorian had insisted it remain small. No sweeping displays, no velvet ropes, no intrusive cameras. Just the people who mattered most. Soraya walked through the entrance hand in hand with her cousin, unaware of what waited on the other side of the hedge-lined corridor. Laughter floated toward her, carried by the wind and the presence of loved ones gathered in clusters beneath the canopy of dusk. At first glance, it looked like a simple gathering, a casual celebration of nothing in particular. But she noticed the details. Her favorite lemon blossom candles lit the path. Her mother, standing beside Dorian's sister, wore the silk scarf Soraya had gifted her last winter. And at the center of it all, Dorian waited by the same garden fountain where their paths had intertwined the first time. He smiled when she stepped into view, soft and full of something unspoken. He didn't rush to her. He waited, allowing her to take it all in. The gentle murmur of voices, the warmth of familiar faces, and the slow realization that every detail in that space had been curated for her. Soraya's heart thudded, not from spectacle, but from sincerity. There was no podium, no flash of gold-plated announcements, just the quiet elegance of intention. The garden, once a place of silent hope, had become the stage for something even more meaningful. A love that chose to stay, to grow, and now to promise. Dorian took a step toward her, not hurried, not rehearsed. The conversations around them softened naturally, as if the garden itself understood this was a moment meant to be held gently. He reached for Soraya's hands, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles in the same familiar way he always did when he wanted her attention without demanding it. She looked up at him, her breath caught somewhere between surprise and knowing. "I didn't plan this to be perfect," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I planned it to be honest." A small smile tugged at her lips, her eyes already shining. "I met you when you weren't trying to be seen," he continued. "And somehow, that was the most powerful thing about you. You didn't impress me, you didn't perform, you just showed up. And that changed me." He paused, letting the words land. "With you, I learned that love doesn't need to be loud to be certain. It just needs to be true. You taught me how to listen better, how to wait, how to stay." Dorian slowly lowered himself onto one knee, not for spectacle, but for meaning. The garden fell completely still. "Soraya," he said softly, "I don't promise perfection. I promise presence. I promise to choose you, even on the days when choosing is hard. I promise to see you, even when you forget how to be seen." He opened the small velvet box in his hand. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, unmistakably thoughtful. "Will you walk through life with me?" Soraya covered her mouth, emotion spilling freely now. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, through tears and laughter, "Yes." There were no drones overhead, no photographers poised with long lenses, no symphony playing an over-rehearsed ballad, just the soft wind brushing through the leaves and the subtle rustle of fabric as the guests instinctively gave them space, honoring the quiet beauty of what had just happened. Soraya leaned into Dorian, her forehead gently resting against his. It was reminiscent of their first dance, when everything had felt uncertain yet unexplainably right. Back then, they had been strangers drawn to each other by something neither could name. Now, that same pull remained, but it was deeper, rooted in shared silences. Long walks and truths, confessed in the safety of 2 a.m. phone calls. "I can't believe you remembered this spot," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could I forget?" Dorian replied, "This is where everything shifted, where I first saw you, not just with my eyes, but with my heart." They stayed like that for a moment, wrapped in their own stillness, as if time understood it wasn't needed here. Every part of the setting seemed to echo that first night's intimacy, the subtle golden lights strung. Above, the curved garden bench in the corner, even the faint scent of lavender floating in the air. It felt sacred. When they finally turned back to their guests, their hands remained locked. Dorian didn't let go, not out of obligation but reverence. There had been no announcements, no spectacle, just a moment so honest it didn't need decoration. And in that unfiltered love, Soraya felt something she'd never felt before. Peace. Not the kind you chase, the kind you earn, moment by moment, by being exactly who you are and being loved anyway. The same garden, the same soft amber lighting swaying in the breeze. But everything felt new now, reborn, not because the venue had changed, but because Soraya had. It had been a year since the night that altered her rhythm. A year since a whisper turned into a promise. A year since the girl in the corner of the wedding became the woman, walking in with quiet certainty beside the man who saw her first. Now, guests mingled and laughed around her at the anniversary gala, an event Dorian insisted on hosting not in grand halls or mirrored ballrooms, but right here, where it all began. It was their own kind of sacred tradition, a way of honoring the unseen roots that had grown between them. Soraya stepped away briefly, letting her eyes wander over the place that once felt like a stage too big for someone like her. She remembered how, back then, she'd folded into herself, shrinking to avoid the gaze of a world that seemed louder than her soul could bear. But today, she didn't shrink. Her posture was different. There was a softness to her shoulders, but not the old kind, not the one born of insecurity. This softness was strength that had nothing left to prove. Her smile was easy, unforced. She moved like someone who had stopped asking the world for permission. The past year hadn't been perfect. Love never is. But it had been patient, deep, rooted in mornings without makeup and arguments followed by warm apologies. It had been built in ordinary moments, and those, she'd learned, were what real love is made of. She wasn't the same woman anymore. And as she turned to rejoin the celebration, the music shifted, signaling something more. A moment was coming. Back at their candle-lit table, nestled beneath a trellis of blooming wisteria, Soraya's fingers brushed against a small box wrapped in soft ivory paper. She hadn't noticed it before, not until Dorian leaned closer, his voice gentle beside her ear. "For later," he said, his eyes warm, his hand resting lightly on hers. She waited until the music dipped into a familiar classical hush before she lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned by velvet lining, was the same delicate music box, the one she'd received with the invitation that had changed everything. She hadn't seen it in months. Her breath caught as she turned the tiny golden key. A moment later, the first notes of Claire de Lune floated through the garden, weaving themselves between laughter, glasses clinking, and subtle gasps from nearby guests who recognized the tune. She held it close, the melody unearthing something soft and childlike in her chest. A year ago, the music box had come as a mystery, a bridge from her quiet past into a future she hadn't dared to imagine. But now, it wasn't a question mark. It was a memory keeper. She remembered the first time it had played, not just during that magical moment of invitation, but much earlier, in her childhood, when her father would turn the key and let the tune fill their little living room. Her mother would hum along, and young Soraya would twirl in socks on the rug, certain she was a ballerina. She'd forgotten that version of herself. Now, with the box nestled in her palms again, she could feel that little girl returning, not as someone lost, but as someone found, folded neatly into the woman she'd become. The music faded, her fingers lingered. She didn't need grand applause. This moment was enough. They noticed her now. The same eyes that once skimmed past her in crowded rooms, those same eyes now lingered, tracking every step she took as she crossed the garden with the music box in her hand. Is that her? She's the one who caught Dorian Vale's heart. She was alone at the wedding, remember? Quiet, sat in the back. The murmurs drifted through champagne bubbles and chandeliers strung between trees. But Soraya didn't shrink from them. Not this time. She didn't adjust her dress or smooth down her hair like she used to when she felt a tension creeping in. She didn't quicken her steps or lower her gaze. She simply walked with the ease of someone who knew her place and no longer needed permission to hold it. Dorian met her halfway, slipping his hand into hers with the same steadiness. That had guided her through every moment since that wedding night. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was her compass. And still, the whispers continued, not cruel, not pitying, just curious, awestruck even. There was a time when that would have rattled her, when every sideways glance felt like a judgment. But now, with her fingers interlaced with Dorian's and the music box pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, she understood something vital. She was never meant to disappear to be safe. Visibility wasn't a threat anymore. It was a declaration. And those whispers, they weren't walls closing in. They were acknowledgements, not of a billionaire's date, not of a stranger with luck, but of a woman who walked through doubt, danced through fear, and stood tall in the light she thought she wasn't allowed to touch. They saw her now, because she saw herself first. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting soft gold across the garden, brushing light onto faces and gowns and silverware that sparkled like stars catching their breath. Somewhere behind them, the soft strains of a string quartet wove through the evening like silk. Soraya stepped onto the small platform. Nothing extravagant, just a wooden riser tucked between rows of lantern-lit tables. The breeze tugged gently at her dress, the same pastel blue she wore the night everything changed. A few heads turned. Dorian stood off to the side, watching her with the kind of quiet pride that needed no performance. He wasn't urging her on. He didn't need to. This was her moment, and she knew it. Not because anyone handed it to her, but because she had chosen to take it. She looked out across the gathering. Familiar faces, new friends, curious strangers. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I used to believe, she began, that being seen meant being loud. That to matter, I had to take up space, make noise, be more than I am. She paused, letting the silence stretch, not uncomfortably but intentionally. But I've learned something else, something quieter, something stronger. Her fingers brushed the edge of the music box at her side. I never needed to be loud. I just needed to be heard. A hush fell. No claps yet. Just breath, collective and still, as if her words had settled gently onto each heart present. And in that moment, the girl who once sat alone at a wedding, shrinking under the weight of invisibility, now stood in full bloom. Not louder at all. Just heard. And that made all the difference. Sometimes the loudest battles are the silent ones, the war of wondering if you matter. If your quiet presence is enough in a world that often rewards noise over nuance. Soraya's journey wasn't about glittering entrances or commanding rooms. It was about something deeper. Something many of us carry but rarely speak of, the desire to be seen without having to shout. She arrived alone at a wedding, unnoticed, unsure, quietly hoping not to be swallowed by her own doubt. And yet, it was in her stillness that something powerful unfolded. A man saw her, not just the surface, but the layers beneath. Not the perfection the world demands, but the honesty she carried in her silence. This wasn't a story of grand gestures or loud declarations. It was a story of intimacy found in a whisper, love revealed through attention and healing that grew in small, consistent moments. The kind of love that doesn't rush to impress, but waits, learns, listens. We talk a lot about fairy tales, but maybe the real magic happens when someone sees you're quiet and stays anyway. And maybe being invisible isn't about not being worthy, it's just that the right eyes haven't found you yet. So if you've ever felt overlooked in a crowded room, if you've ever wondered whether your softness was a weakness, remember this. You don't need to change your volume to be valued. You don't need to become louder to matter. Your story, just as it is enough. And when the right person sees you, not the version you polish for the world, but the honest, unsure, beautiful truth underneath, that's when you'll know you were never invisible, just waiting to be heard. If you enjoyed this love story, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, have you ever felt truly seen by someone? Your story matters. We read every comment, and your words might just inspire the next story we tell. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most powerful love stories begin in silence.